Hello and welcome to episode 8 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak to retired microbiologist Dr. David Livermore on the growing concerns about the Lucy Letby verdict and how the Daily Sceptic led the world in raising them.
There's no hard, convincing evidence that she committed these murders.
Dr. Angus Dalgleish, emeritus professor of oncology at the University of London, on how the first report of the COVID inquiry has blown up the establishment's pro-lockdown consensus.
I look really forward to see whether this putting the blame on the people who deserve it continues. It's hope that they might actually.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with Stephen Tucker, who looks at French politics, immigration, and the West's post-human elites through the eyes of France's most celebrated and controversial novelist, Michel Houellebecq.
Rather than calling him prophetic, it might actually just be better to call him honest.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show.
Now, the neonatal nurse Lucy Letby joined the ranks of Britain's most notorious serial child killers last year when she was convicted of the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 7 others. Yet, she was never seen to harm any babies, and much of her conviction rested on circumstantial evidence. And in recent weeks, the question that is increasingly being asked is, did she do it? Well, to discuss that now, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. David Livermore, a former microbiologist and a regular contributor to the Daily Sceptic. Welcome to The Sceptic, David.
My pleasure.
Okay, so there have been many people raising concerns about this in recent months. Obviously, a few months ago, there was this piece in the New Yorker. That couldn't be read by most people here, but some people certainly did. And then recently, now that her second trial has finished, there has been pieces in The Guardian and The Telegraph in the same week. Then there's been the Daily Mail. Peter Hitchens has been raising concerns about this. It's been in Private Eye. And then most recently, we've had the MP David Davis saying he's really going to take this forward in the Commons and start a debate about it. So obviously concerns about this have been really taking off recently, but let's go all the way back to September 2023, which is just after her first trial finished. And you penned an article in the Daily Sceptic about this, raising a lot of these concerns. And, the world heard it here first, really. But what were those concerns that you had back then, and why did they prompt you to write the article? Can you just take us through this?
Well, I took an interest in this case as a microbiologist because there was a cluster of about 17 deaths, 8 of which Miss Letby was charged with. One was then thrown out. So the seven murders for which she was convicted, plus another 10 deaths. And it looked to me, as people published distribution of seats, like there's something I'd seen so often when I worked for the Health Protection Agency, which is now the UK Health Security Agency, which is an outbreak of infection. That's what it looked like, and I read the bits about the plumber having been repeatedly called to look at sewage leaks. And then I find myself being quite amazed that Ms. Letby is being convicted as a series of murders, which, as I say, are 7 out of 17 deaths that occurred in that 12-month period from mid-2015 to mid-2016. And I look in more detail and I find, well, there's no hard, convincing evidence that she committed these murders. The assertion was she injected air, but nobody saw her inject air. There were assertions about 2 attempted murders with insulin, but I quickly find that the assays were done by a laboratory that said, actually, if you think exogenous external insulin has been administered, then you should get an expert forensic lab to check this, not our own results. And I find also that other people are questioning this trial from quite different perspectives myself, particularly statistical perspectives, and the way that a rota had been put together that appeared to match Ms. Letby to every untoward event or death that had occurred in the unit, but omitted the ones for which she wasn't charged. So, but was this table just a listing of untoward events for which Lucy Letby was present, which, of course, would lead one to suspect that she was present for every such event, simply because list the ones out where she wasn't present? And day after day, I would see also in the newspapers, this is Lucy Letby's confession document. And I would try to read it in the normal way one reads something from left to right across the page, and it made no blathering sense whatsoever. All it was a random word salad, and then others managed to break this out into particular sentences written at different times as some stream of consciousness, perhaps when her mind was disturbed. Some of it reads, they went, I did this, I am evil. And of course the newspapers have been quoting, I did this, I am evil. And yet they went implies that somebody else asserted this. They went, they said. So I was left with considerable doubt about this trial and its outcome. And someone else, I forget the name of the person, wrote an article in the Daily Sceptic that said Lucy Letby should hang. And I'm no general opponent of capital punishment. If you told me Harold Shipman should have hung before he took his own life, then I wouldn't have raised the slightest objection. But to say that somebody should hang when there is such doubt from multiple sources about their conviction rather shocked me. And that was what led me to put my neck on the line and actually to write. And that was picked up in the September by Peter Hitchens, who cited me extensively and commented then in his column in the Mail on Sunday. And I believe, because I had a number of calls from journos, that others would have picked up on it at the time, but then Ms. Letby got charged with one of the cases for which the original recharged for one of the attempted murders for which the original jury couldn't reach a decision. And blanket reporting restrictions were applied, which made it impossible to comment. I've been scheduled to go to Piers Morgan's show on Talk TV, and that got cancelled. I was approached by Felicity Lawrence, who has subsequently written articles in The Guardian in the past few weeks. And I believe a lot more would have been said a lot sooner were it not for the way those reporting restrictions were applied.
But yeah, so, I mean, as you mentioned, after her first trial ended, there was this brief period where it could be commented on, but then the reporting restrictions came back in during the second trial. And I know that people have been critical of this. So back in April, when the New Yorker article came out, that big expose, he raised a question in the comments saying that actually the fact that we couldn't read this was, quote, in defiance of open justice. So do you think there's a problem here with our contempt of court laws?
I think there is an issue there. I mean, the restrictions are there for good reason, so that you don't get lots and lots of comment about a defendant prior to their trial and thereby potentially biasing the jury. But it's not worked properly this time, because what happened was, through the trial that finished last summer, or following the trial that finished last summer, for which she was convicted of 7 murders, there was vast coverage about what an evil person she was, one of Britain's biggest mass killer nurse, etc., which clearly would influence any jury that you subsequently recruited. So what the reporting restrictions actually did in this case was to prevent people like myself and Sarah Napton and Felicity Lawrence and others from commenting and saying, "Oi, look, there is some doubt about this. Not everybody is comfortable with these convictions." And therefore, the restrictions have surely worked in quite the opposite way to what they were intended to do. Instead of preventing the biasing of the jury, they've actually left the jury with the bias from the "isn't she terrible" press reporting of last summer, but with no exposure unless they delve fairly deeply on the internet to people who express doubts and concerns about the conviction. So I do think the lawyers need to think very carefully about this and how the restrictions can work in absolutely the opposite way to how they're intended. Now, I do think the original intention was good, and I would abhor our going to the American system where you can comment at will on a defendant's potential guilt or innocence while the trial is ongoing. I think that's in many ways even worse.
Yeah, so clearly this was a very complex trial. And, for the ordinary men and women of the jury, it would be completely natural for them to defer to the expertise of the witnesses who were called. And obviously the prosecution did call several expert witnesses, but the defense didn't actually end up calling any, neither on the statistics side or the neonatology side. The only witness, in fact, that they called was a plumber. So given the importance of expertise in this case, do you think she had a bit of a substandard defense?
I find it surprising how the defence was conducted. I mean, Ben Myers, who was the leading barrister, as I understand, has a very good reputation. He covers particularly financial crimes and also professional misconduct charges. And I would assume in a way that he was selected because of that expertise on professional misconduct. And I certainly don't want to say anything against the barrister who has a very high reputation, but it just seemed very unusual that they called experts. They did have a gentleman, so I remember out of Southampton, the Portsmouth he was from, briefed to go on the stand, but ultimately didn't call him. And Benjamin Myers worked essentially by attacking the prosecution's claims, by attacking Dewey Evans' standing. Bizarrely, he did not challenge the claim that these infants had or two infants had exogenous insulin. He merely challenged that Lucy Letby had given them said insulin. And that's despite the fact that the assays of insulin were done by a laboratory which was saying that it wasn't working to forensic standards, and that if anybody thought exogenous insulin had been given, they should get it checked elsewhere, which was not done. And then, as I say, he called the plumber. Now, I do think that's of some importance because, as I said right at the start of this discussion, I thought, and I continue to think, that infection was a likely cause of this cluster of 17 deaths. One had, from the plumber's account, a unit which was frequently affected by sewage leaks, which notoriously leave a slew of bacteria that can set up rapidly fatal infections in small infants. For 13, 14 years, I ran the National Reference Laboratory Antibiotic Resistance for UK Health Security Agency's predecessors. And so my lab would look at resistant bacteria, see why they were resistant, what antibiotic was still active, whether there was a public health issue. And I worked in close liaison with the adjacent lab, Laboratory of Healthcare Associated Infection. And they looked, during those 14 years, at many clusters of infections in neonatal units. And the point always was the same, that neonates can succumb very quickly. They don't have a properly developed immune system. You don't always get the signs and symptoms of infection that you would get if you or I had a bacterial infection, and that they are placed in cots, which are often very close together, which facilitates cross-infection. And if you add a sewage leak into that, then you've got a disaster waiting to happen, which I continue to think was a very likely explanation of the cluster of deaths. Because otherwise you have to, let's be clear, if you believe Lucy Letby was responsible for 7 deaths, you have to accept that those were 7 deaths within a cluster of 17. And that for the other 10, Julie Evans, chief prosecution witness, said on talk radio, and I checked today, the link, which is in my original article, still works. He says that they died, these other 10 died of the things that small infants usually die of hemorrhage, infection, congenital abnormality. He's not saying that these were another 10, which I think she's guilty of, but I can't pin him on her. He's saying that they were of natural, if unfortunate, causes. And there were 2 things going on at once, which is remarkable to the point of being difficult to believe.
Yeah. Okay, so there's been a lot of commentary about this trial, and one of the criticisms of that is that obviously, none of us were there in the trial, and we didn't hear necessarily all the evidence. Obviously, the men and women of the trial sat in there for months and months and did hear everything, and they have now convicted her twice, in fact. So, shouldn't we have more faith in the verdict of the jury?
I'm a great supporter of trial by jury. However, I do think there's a concern here, firstly, that the defence failed to call experts. And people are persuadable by experts, and they only heard experts on one side of this story. So I do think that was a point where the defence was deficient, and that may have affected the jury. The next point to make is that the great majority of the verdicts, the 2 insulin ones were an exception, I think there's one more exception, were 10-1 majority verdicts, whereas 1 juror dropped out. I don't know why. I would rather assume it was for health or commitment reasons or whatever, but the great majority of these convictions are based on majority verdicts. And this is incredibly technical evidence where people persuade by experts, and they've only got experts on one side of the argument.
Okay, so people who've been critical of the Lucy Letby verdict have often themselves been dismissed as sort of Lucy Letby truthers or armchair detectives. What do you make of those criticisms?
Well, juries clearly do not always get it right, because some appeals are successful and some people are freed long after they were wrongfully convicted by juries. Andrew Malkinson on a rape conviction would be a recent example, and I'm bound to get this the wrong way around, the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, or the Guildford 6 and the Birmingham 4. I really can't remember which way round the numbers work. But again, notorious examples of people who were wrongly convicted, in that case of IRA bombing offences. So juries do get it wrong. Truthers and such like, this isn't just the normal malcontents who've appeared from the woodwork to criticise this outcome. You've got newspapers on the political left, The Guardian and The Independent ran an article. You've got Private Eye. You've newspapers on the political right. Peter Hitchens in the Mail and Mail on Sunday. Sarah Napton in the Daily Telegraph. You've got criticism from the Royal Statistical Society. You're not going to dismiss the Royal Statistical Society as truthers. You've got criticism from medical experts, from the lab microbiologist, from the reference lab microbiologist myself, and again from statisticians. You've got quite a broad range of people being critical here. So I think to dismiss us all when we come from different standpoints is very quite arrogant.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so finally, what would you like to see happen now?
Well, two things that can be done. One is Ms. Letby can apply to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. I would hope she does so, and I would hope that they expedite and look into a case, not least because it has caused so much disquiet over such a range of people. The other thing that's starting up is the Thirlwall inquiry, which was predicated upon Ms. Letby's guilt and looking how systems can be developed, changed to prevent such things, and looking into the ways that the Countess of Chester Hospital was deficient. Clearly, the Thirlwall Commission cannot set itself, Thirlwall inquiries rather, cannot set itself up as a retrial. But I do think it has to take cognizance of the amount of doubt that has arisen around this case. I'm encouraged that it's apparently accepted a report from the Royal Statistical Society as evidence. And I would encourage them to look at the report that was put together by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health back at the end of 2016, which perhaps we should have mentioned earlier. This was a report that was commissioned by the Countess of Chester Hospital, looking into the cluster of deaths and adverse events, which concluded that effectively the unit was working beyond its capabilities, that it didn't have sufficient staff and it didn't have sufficiently skilled staff. In particular, it had no neonatologists per se. It merely had a paediatric consultant with a particular interest in neonatology. They found no evidence of wrongdoing, but they found plenty of evidence that it was a unit which was understaffed, not up to scratch, its cots were too close together, it didn't have the right people, etc. It was actually on the strength of that evidence at the start of 2017, the managers tried to get the consultant medics to apologise to Lucy Letby, who by then had been transferred to a desk job. Apparently there were confidential codicils to that report, which looked specifically at the issue of whether there had been malfeasance, and concluded that there hadn't been. It was merely a struggling unit. I do think the Thirlwall Commission needs to look very, very closely at that report with an open mind, because the counter view is that these 17 deaths were all consequent on a malfunctioning unit rather than miscreant nurse. Maybe some of these babies could not have been saved whatever one did for them. Many of them were very sickly and very premature, but some of them certainly couldn't.
Okay, Dr. David Livermore, thanks very much for coming on.
My pleasure.
Now, the ongoing COVID inquiry has released its first report. And given how it's been going so far, one could be forgiven for expecting it to be a bit of an establishment stitch-up. Much of the testimony has been very pro-lockdown, with Sir Patrick Vallance, among others, saying that the only problem with our pandemic response was that we didn't lock down earlier. But that isn't quite what happened. Baroness Hallett, the chair of the inquiry, has done the unthinkable and come out with some criticism of lockdowns. Quote, "The imposition of a lockdown," she said, "should be a measure of last resort. Indeed, there are those who would argue that a lockdown should never be imposed. A little understated, perhaps. But while the follies of lockdown are, nothing new to our audience, this, for the lockdown-loving establishment, this is quite the bombshell. So to discuss that, I'm pleased to be joined now by Dr. Angus Dalgleish, emeritus professor of oncology at the University of London and one of the co-signatories of the Great Barrington Declaration. So, Angus, what's your take on this report? Has Baroness Hallett just blown up the pro-lockdown consensus?
Well, my take on her report was one of, first of all, surprise, because having followed all the evidence that she was given, it was a troop of people who were basically defending lockdown and arguing that it should have been introduced quicker, earlier, it should have been longer and harder. And it was people after people, and a lot of this was done based on modelling. And you cannot ignore that Neil Ferguson was behind a lot of the doom and gloom that led to the fact that we've got no option but to lockdown. Why they listen to this man? I mean, in my view, I would like to know a single major projection that has ever been remotely true that he's made. I mean, he's been an unmitigated disaster. Think of foot and mouth mad cow disease. I mean, up to the COVID, probably caused more damage to the economy than any other singular epidemiologist statistician. I mean, the culling of the cows and everything like that that's been out there was totally over the top. Farms ruined, lives ruined, suicides, everything. So why they listened again to his projections, as opposed to people like me? I gave my input into cabinet through people we knew and told them all these things. And as a very senior medical professional, and I was not impressed with the fact that we were totally ignored and felt that the advice wasn't necessary. And when I pointed out various things, it was kind of, well, you're the only one type of thing. Now, where have we heard that before? In a post office inquiry, people actually telling the truth and being dismissed as the only one. Well, I've subsequently found out lots of people like me who've experienced commissions who all gave very similar advice. And we're all, collectively ignored. And I found another one who's told he's the only one shut up. So what on earth was going on? So I really thought that this inquiry would be this one massive cover-up to protect all this. So I am delighted, absolutely delighted that it has revealed what I was saying. I was screaming in the wilderness. I'm just an oncologist. If you lock down, I'm going to see thousands and thousands of unnecessary deaths over the next 2-3 years because I'm not going to be able to screen and treat early. Well, obviously mine is not just 1,000, but I'm talking collectively for everybody. Once you do a lockdown like that, and it's the fear was the worst thing that they put into people. So people who really desperately needed surgery for a lesion to be removed would phone at the last minute because they were too frightened to come to hospital and catch COVID. I mean, we were talking the first wave before the vaccine rollout, as it were. But anyhow, anybody who looked at all the evidence could see that when the lockdown was introduced, it was far too late. So it's far too late. There was no point doing it. These things are too quick, and they're too vague to be able to justify a lockdown. Indeed, I think that it was said by people in the reports with regards to SAGE and people like that it is hard to impose any of these things unless you have a 30% death rate. Well, by the time it was introduced, we already had the first wave was falling. It was introduced halfway down the slope here. When introducing it, did nothing. I believe it did absolutely nothing but destroy livelihoods, lives, relationships, education, businesses, the economy, whatever it is. So the bottom line was, why did nobody discuss and think this through? Because it was be obvious to a policeman 100 yards that lockdown was going to cause devastation in the economy for the next few years afterwards. So why did they not take this seriously? Why did they criminally assassinate, character-wise, Angus Dalgleish? who was the only one in a position of authority who said what I regard as the obvious. This will achieve nothing but destruction. And just to show the environment we live in, 2,000 people of the Swedish Academy wrote to the Prime Minister and said, this guy is a lunatic, sack him and introduce lockdown. That Prime Minister stood by that guy. And the result is history. They made the same mistake as us in the first part. They shoved everybody into care homes without testing them from hospital. That caused a big lit of deaths. But those people, I argue, would have died at any rate. It's just you're just messing around with the date of death over a few months. So it sounds careless, but that's basically what it was. But after that, with the absence of lockdown, Sweden has shown that it's got the lowest excess death rates in the entire Western world. And the only thing that's different was the lockdown and the vaccine imposition. They were only really keen on people over 70. That's another thing, because it's not been covered by the inquiry. I mean, as was our vaccine thing, but we're talking about the lockdown here. And it's just one of the reasons why it wasn't lifted earlier, quicker and sooner. I mean, it was, I think that was due to people trying to justify the unjustifiable. We should have lifted it after 2 or 3 weeks when it was obvious that the incidence had fallen completely flat. Nobody was really dying of COVID. And that's the other thing which I think was a part of the great cover-up. I wrote that of the report, I was really quite pleased to see everything written down with one exception. And that was the illusion that 235,000 people died of COVID. It's absolutely ludicrous. I think that figure is no more than 70 or 80,000 over a couple of years. Remember, this is over a few years. So the actual COVID deaths over a couple of years, I think, were no more than 70, 80,000, which over 2 years of bad flu, that's in the ballpark, 30,000 people a year. You just expect this as part of the course die of flu every winter. So it's not that big a deal to have 80,000 over 2 years dying. And it's a bigger deal from basically the impositions and restrictions, etc., that we had to put up with were just ludicrous. And when even at the time, certainly by the time of the second lockdown, it was very obvious that the average age of the death was exceptionally high. It was 82. And the age of death of everything else was 81. So there was not a single justifiable reason for the second lockdown. And where was the drive? It's coming from these computer miners, which basically, I mean, I believe that they should all be defunded because they haven't actually done. They've not only done nothing useful, but they've actually done massive damage. And I was horrified to read relative to this that Ferguson's group has been refunded by the Gates organisation. Again, why are they funding a failed modeller? What is it behind them? But at any rate, back to the lockdown. She then focused and named names, which I thought this thing was basically to delay naming and shaming until after they were all dead or whatever, because it was the time span. But no, she really went for Hunt.
I mean, because that's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, a typical inquiry will take place long after the people involved have sort of shuffled out of public life. But in this case, some of the people who are being named and shamed are very much still around. Can you just take us through some of those?
Yes, without doubt. I mean, I believe, in retrospect, it's an elephant in the room to ignore the fact that Hunt was the longest-serving health secretary in recent memory, and all this came up on his watch. And as I wrote in my piece, I know that the Cirrus thing was a plan to investigate how we'd cope with such a pandemic arising. And it showed that we were prepared for it. And what I do know from other sources was that there was a relief that the WHO had assured them that any such escape in Asia would easily be contained. They had such systems in place. So we didn't have to worry too much. And it seems that very much was what I call the Yes Minister Plan C Is there anything else we can do? Yes, plan C, cross your fingers and hope it doesn't happen. And it would appear from everything that was what happened. But, there was the plan for flu. And the big disaster was Hancock ripped it up because this was a respiratory virus. It was no different in how you handle it from flu. The main problem was the initial death, spread, and infectious, and that was because it was genetically engineered. It was genetically engineered to be much more infectious to human receptors. And it wasn't just the ACE receptor, it was highly modified to hit a whole batch of other receptors. Actually, the ones which, very interestingly, affect taste and smell, which became a clinical hallmark. Indeed, clinically, one of the ways that people could differentiate clinically and rapidly without tests or scans or anything, what it's like to be COVID or flu or just a big cold, as it were. So the point of mentioning that is we knew it was very, very bad. It escaped from the lab. It was very badly handled. If the WHO had been remotely competent, it would never have reached Europe, but the WHO was compromised by China. It wouldn't let them do what they wanted to do, and basically were quiescent puppies on the string, as it were. They did not do their job at all, apart from instill fear, which was, in the end, actually caused an incredible amount of damage. But the whole point of saying is we knew it was bad, but we also knew in all pandemics. So one of the things about becoming an expert on learning history and pandemics is they all come in waves. There's a big wave. It infects lots of people. It kills some of them, whether it's like COVID, hardly anybody, 0.085%, or like Ebola, 30% or something like that. And then it all settles down, particularly the respiratory ones. Then you'll get a secondary wave, and they're all much less. Nothing to worry about as it dies out and attenuates out. That was always going to happen. And because of the genetic engineering, the first wave was always going to be the worst. So people should know in that and not instill the total over-the-top behaviour with regards to the second, third wave, as it were, and having a secondary lockdown with all the evidence saying this is madness to do this. It's unbelievable madness. And another reason I pointed out right at the beginning, I said anybody who wants to introduce lockdown is, an infectious disease illiterate, because we hadn't induced quarantine. I mean, if you really want to contain something, you have quarantine to stop it getting out. Yeah, we had lockdown. Well, we had planes coming in for a Wuhan 3 weeks into lockdown every day without any quarantine. This is illiteracy and incompetence on the grand scale. And I personally, Hancock and Hunt and Whitty and Vallance and Farrar and Ferguson should all be very glad that Baroness Hallett's leading this inquiry and not me. Because I would want a lot more questions answered, which I believe that cannot be answered if the truth is told.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Vallance there. What do you make of the fact that he's now been appointed as Science Minister in the new Labour government?
Well, the first thing that springs to mind is Winston Churchill's acute observation that the definition of success is to go from one disaster to another with no loss of momentum. And that's certainly a step forward, Patrick Vallance. And I can't see any reason why he should have been Chief Scientific Officer in the first place. I know his colleagues at GSK when he was head of research there. I've not heard anything that I would regard as a positive indictment or a reference for the next job. But in spite of that, he was made Chief Scientific Officer. He's a totally inappropriate person, in my humble opinion, because he's no good at making decisions. He just chairs committees. This is what all I have been told. And he contradicts himself all the time. He actually said some sensible things on the run-up and then did the opposite. Why? So did Chris Whitty. I mean, I've got no time for Chris Whitty at all. I think it's a walking disaster and he should have been sacked, or if he had any integrity, he should have resigned. Do not go through with this. It will cause unmitigated harm. they said sensible things. They said the only way to deal with this is to wait for a natural immunity. And that's what they should have done, and shielded the so-called lockdown should just be those who were at risk, like they did in Sweden. Tell the old people to stay indoors, we'll deliver your food, this, that, and the other. But the young people, you go out and do what you're doing, because no one's dying from of the young people from this disease. If they did, they had major morbidities, and they would have died from the next flu thing in a lot of cases. So with regards to the thing about solidity, this was all known. What I want to do is the first lockdown, that's been through, we should never have happened. But I really think the big crime was actually the second and beyond. They had learned nothing from the first one. All the data coming in basically showed that their initial feelings were correct. So why did they ignore them and go with the narrative? So, that was their job, not to allow that to happen. And, I also must say, I do take issue with Boris Johnson, who, at the end of the day, he has to carry the can. He appointed Hancock, he appointed these people. And when they're of no use, it's your job to get rid of them or to replace them. And, he did nothing.
And so finally, obviously, you've told me about some of the points you were making at the time that kind of went ignored. And obviously, a big one of those is the Great Barrington Declaration in October 2020. And I know that you and others received an enormous amount of criticism about that from people like Matt Hancock. So are you now feeling vindicated?
Well, it was very obvious to me as a clinician actually practicing through this, albeit I was an oncologist. But I'm one of the very few people who's actually been an honorary consultant in the NHS as a general physician, a virologist, an immunologist, and lastly a medical oncologist. There's very few people who have actually done all four positions for the NHS. So I believe that I was very, very well qualified, and I did a lot of work on HIV. I predicted the HIV vaccine failure many times over 30 years. It was constantly ignored. Collaborated with someone who's made one that actually works based on the principles. And it was obvious to me that this was a disease that if it only is going to kill older people at risk and it was airborne, the best protection was basic innate immunity. And I screened this and was ignored. I even wrote things that went through to Cabinet and Sage to and I found lots of others who did the same thing. We were all ignored. The most important thing with something like that is innate herd immunity, but most people are very bad innate herd immunity, particularly when they're over 55, and particularly in the UK, because it declines largely after 55. What is the one thing you can do to prevent it declining and to give you good herd immunity is vitamin D. Now, we pushed very strongly that the cheapest way to deal with this would be for the abysmally low vitamin D levels to be upped with a national plan of giving everybody a decent vitamin D. Shows you that all experts are often useless. The National Advisory Committee on Nutrition said that 400 units was enough. This time was well past the second lockdown. They got to examine this, which I know as a clinician is garbage. It might be enough for bone development in children, but it's certainly not enough for immune deficiency in adults, where you need thousands of international units to do it. And, so I was arguing for this. I had several of my friends got very ill with COVID. And one of them phoned me at 5 a.m, hardly able to breathe. And I had the usual thing. I said, just load yourselves up with vitamin D, gargle with aspirin and mouthwashes. Get some Megatide, which is the asthma inhaler from somebody. Everyone seems to know somebody with asthma, and would consider steroids. Now, not one of these people who I gave this advice to did not improve rapidly. There was only one who had really ongoing, was just not that good, and I didn't prescribe it. It was my first entree. and she had a fantastic recovery from ivermectin. Now, we now know, in retrospect, ivermectin was the best single quick agent to cure COVID going. Who did the very best he could to stop it? Fauci and Whitty and Valens always took up the cudgelry. We would never have needed a vaccine program if they realised ivermectin worked so well. But it was suppressed by Fauci. He wanted that vaccine program to roll out. And there's all things like that. So going back to this herd immunity side of things, you only needed a few things like that, and everybody would have good herd immunity eventually. And you, as I said, you wouldn't have needed the vaccine program. The Great Barrington Declaration was colleagues, particularly epidemiology ones in this country at Gupta, who just epidemiologists basically realised this was the obvious, and this is what we should be doing. No more lockdowns, natural immunity, this, that, and the other. I wrote this article in the Daily Mail. I was really shouted down by Hancock as a dangerous maverick lunatic or something like that. I ended up writing the next article saying that this guy is a mad, petulant teenager. I mean, he's ridiculous. He wouldn't engage with the science. He just shouted us down as if we were mad mavericks and must be ignored, silenced, everything. That is not how you deal with a crisis. Instead, we're following science when we were trying to bring science to the table. So they never followed science. They lied. And from that point of view, everybody said we're following the science, the vaccines are safe and effective, they should all be held to account, I believe. And this needs to go further. But we're talking about this first report, which is a fantastic relief, because we know it was an attempt to cover up and support the lockdown. It hasn't happened. So my next big thing is, I and my colleagues have signed lots of evidence for the vaccine part of the inquiry. And after receiving all that evidence, the vaccine part of the inquiry was pushed past the agreed date after the next election. So I now await whether the same insight, honesty of the inquiry is going to be applied to the vaccines, where I think, with regards to lockdown, it was just unbelievable stupidity, people not fit for purpose, lots of incompetence. They should all be fired, these people who are involved in this. So no doubt about it, all be fired. Somebody has to pay a price for stupidity. A doctor can lose his livelihood for one error that leads to one death. These guys have led to hundreds of thousands less, and yet they lie so hard. The idea that 22 million people were saved by the vaccines has to be the biggest piece of misconstruction or garbage I have ever come across in my life, because I know that the same data, you can actually ask the question, did anybody benefit from the vaccines whatsoever? And then you get into all the people who are now applying for a compensation from having their lives ruined by the vaccines, of which there is no doubt. It's just the extent to which that's known. So I look really forward to see whether this openness, honesty, and really putting the blame on the people who deserve it continues. It's hope that they might actually.
Okay, well, Dr. Angus Dalgleish, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.